The final session of today, I'm very pleased to welcome a very strong panel of contributions from inside and outside the Academy, but we're going to be focusing on this session on financing the future city. And we're starting first of all with Mark Hinnells, who in that geometry is both inside and outside the Academy simultaneously, but we'll say more about it. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much. I should say that the work that is presented here was done over a couple of years. Whilst I was based in the university at the Environmental Change Institute as part of the Future of Cities programme, at that time and increasingly now, I also have a role in a business called Susenco, short for the Sustainable Energy Company, and we do consulting and we have developed renewable energy projects as well. The work that I'm referring to was written up in two books, one a more academic-y book, and the reference for that is in the presentation, and I've borrowed liberally from it, so if you've got any interest it's all in there. And in a more policy-oriented book, which was written when the Liberal Democrats wanted to regain the green agenda, having had it somewhat diluted over the last few years, looking towards the next general election, which is the aim being what does a liberal and democratic energy market look like. So the work's written up there, and please do, I've got the references in there. Happy to talk about them more later. The work here is to explore the implications of a dramatic reduction in carbon emissions. The objective at the present time is at least 80%, but that, whatever the final number turns out to be or doesn't turn out to be, there's an indication of a dramatic level of change over a period of time, and it may be sudden, and it may be rapid at some times, and it may be slow at others. There's a general recognition that to deliver that change, policy needs to change in terms of how we guide the energy market, how we guide individual investments. There's less of an understanding of the implications of that for business, because I don't know why there's less of an understanding, but it's important that that understanding improves. But there will be the creation of, potentially, of winners and losers in terms of the existing structure if policy moves rapidly enough to cause that level of change in emissions. And so my interest, partly with an academic hat and partly with a commercial hat, is to understand what's new and what's out there, what might be around the corner in terms of business models that might begin to displace some of the more established business models. As I say, the context for the research was that I was partly in the Environmental Change Institute and partly in Susenco. ECI has a long-standing track record in looking at energy markets and change and advising on policy change. And as I say, Susenco started out as a consultancy and develops renewable energy projects. This is important for the research because the research was based on a very close interaction with the market. Being in the market myself, in a sense what I was doing was observing participants in the market very directly and looking at case studies, some of which I was myself involved in. So it gave me the opportunity to be very close to the market in terms of understanding. A key question though is what is the case to be studied in a context like this? Was it a particular product? Was it a particular device or sector? And in fact, it's the thing to be studied is the number of markets out there, and I'll explore that in more depth. But markets could include the market for electricity generation, or buildings, or building technologies, and so on. What I've got here is just to, as I said, that policy is changing very rapidly, and I apologise for the scale of this slide, but it sums up very neatly what's in the book chapter. The policy that's transforming markets is these effectively down this side are the range of markets, and at the top there's if you like, the energy supply domain, which could be heat and it could be electricity, and down here is the more energy use domain. In an industrial context, in a building context, and in an equipment context. And in terms of what's happening to affect those different domains, you can group the interventions by government under a number of headings. Governments set targets to do things. Government can intervene in information measures, which could be things like energy labels on appliances or cars or whatever. Government can provide economic incentives to give some technologies an advantage they didn't previously enjoy because perhaps they were too expensive. And government can regulate to prevent things that happened previously because for now they are less acceptable than perhaps they used to be. And that milieu, if you like, of markets and measures has led to a process of transformation of particular markets. And in a way it follows a kind of an evolutionary approach where the survival conditions for particular products or technologies change. So with information, when there was no energy label on a fridge, you didn't know how much energy it used. It wasn't important in your purchasing decision. But as soon as you have information on how much energy a fridge uses, you kind of think, how much does it cost? And how much does it cost to run? And is it worth me paying a little bit more to get one that's cheaper to run? So it becomes part of your decision-making criteria. And if you can, as many markets have done at different times, give an incentive to the more efficient fridge through a rebate or something, you kind of have to take that into account as well. So it gives those products that previously didn't have an advantage, and then through regulation, for example, Europe has set minimum efficiency standards for fridges and ruled out the worst in the market, and if you like, killed off whole species, to use the evolutionary analogy, of products that were no longer fit. Now, that level of intervention in a market begins to transform it, and maybe not necessarily with fridges, but with some of these other technologies, there are new opportunities that open out, new business models that might open out, and that's what I was interested in. And so it's that background, that's the background to the research, the level of change that's going on in different domains, and the opportunity for new products, for new services particularly. And what I've looked at here is there are a variety of opportunities around service models, around new markets and market making, and around investment that have been opened up by the policy drivers on the right hand side. And I've given examples of particular companies that are in the chapters that are in these different domains. Now, without going into each of the different domains in depth because of shortages of time, perhaps one of the common themes of this, if you like, and particularly given that we're in the finance section, is this recurring issue of off-balance sheet finance, finding other ways to finance opportunities. So, for example, in embedded generation, I was talking to somebody just now. We have a particular interest in doing wind turbines on industrial sites, and it suits us because it's a lower risk project because you're working in a landscape that's already impacted and there's already a noise footprint and so on. But for the site, it gets lower cost power, and it doesn't have to pay for the investment or take the risk. We do that. So that's what we do. So in terms of embedded generation, that's why Susenco's up there. We effectively develop assets off the balance sheet of an industrial site, but it's in our interest to do that because it's lower risk for us, and they get lower cost, lower carbon power out of it. So that's an example of a new emergent market. Energy services companies, I don't know whether folk have come across that concept, but effectively they go into a building, could be one like this, and refurbish the lights, the appliances, the heating system, the cooling system and so on, and put investment in on the customer side of the meter and share the reduced bills that produces. So again, it's an off-balance sheet finance mechanism. And there are several other similar ones. One that I want to go into next is a community model of financing, and I think this is probably the most interesting change that we're seeing in terms of financing low carbon at the moment, and it's something that's discussed particularly in here. At the moment, we have an energy market where there are effectively 6 major players. It's a cartel. It's not very democratic. and it's not very liberal. But one of the routes to changing that market is if communities have their own money at stake, invested in that market, and made profit out of that, and that's what community renewables are. There are a number of organisations which I'll go into in a minute that have invested in that, and I have to say, 5 years ago, I kind of thought, I'm sorry, it's too big a task to change Britain one street at a time. But I have to say, my thought on that has completely stood on its head, because the models are so reproducible from one street to another. And so the organisations that I know and have been working with include these. So, for example, Energy for All helps communities who to develop their own, particularly wind projects. Low Carbon West Oxford is based around the corner here, and have done share issues for PV on roofs and hydro in the Thames and all sorts of things. And some of the benefits of those projects go into refurbishing homes in the community as well. Ovesco is based down in Lewis on the south coast, does a very similar thing, but we know them very well because we are working with them to raise about £3 million to finance a quarter of one of our solar farms that are down near them. So, as I say, it's a very close-up and personal view of finance and community investment. And then Abundance is slightly different. These are all raising equity in projects. And I think you have to raise equity in a project, you have to understand that project very well, given the regulatory issues that are around equity. But Abundance is different. It's net-based, and it's crowdsourced finance, but it's debt rather than equity. So that they're not shareholders in the projects. They don't have the same potentially liabilities, but also the same benefits as shareholders. But it's a very interesting model in terms of provision of finance for renewable energy. In terms of the way the evidence is analysed in the books, I've used an evolutionary approach to technical change in there, and also you looked at institutional frameworks, because innovation is often seen as an isolated and individual activity, and that's very far from the truth. And the evidence shows that institutional frameworks and networks are very important. There's also a very interesting organisational issue in that the new entrants tend to be small and dynamic, whereas incumbents tend to adopt strategies of either being resistant to change, or if they do have to change, what they often do is acquire one of the new entrants and grow that way into new markets. So incumbents can take a very hands-off attitude to change sometimes. Sometimes they can resist change, but if they have to adapt to change, they do it through acquisition. Another approach that was evident was the idea of intrapreneurship. So incumbents in one market become new entrants in an adjacent market as that market grows. In terms of policy implications, there are, I think, hence this, quite big policy implications, because policy at the moment is aimed at very large reduction in carbon emissions without really understanding the organisational implications of that, or the innovation implications of that, or the service models implications of that. And I think that's really important that the government gets to grips with that social and economic and organisational change. Otherwise, I don't think we'll get there, or if we get there, we'll get there at too high a social cost. And just in terms of the work that underpins this, as I say, these are the two major references that were written whilst doing the programme that were up there. I've also done work in a variety of individual markets, looking at energy services and more market transformation policy and so on. There's some work ongoing at the moment on wind on industrial sites that underpins the higher level work, if you like. So happy to talk about that if that's of interest.
Great, thanks very much.
Good afternoon. afternoon, and again, excuse me, I have a dreadful cold. I've just come from Singapore and changing weather. So, just by way of quick background, I'm a real estate developer or chartered surveyor, property valuer by background, who used to work for the Abu Dhabi government, building a thing called Masdar City, which I know Elizabeth referred to yesterday in a previous conversation. So a lot of the talk I'm going to be doing about focusing on smarter cities comes from that. And then also the last 4 years, I've been based in Singapore working for Cisco, but basically been zooming around the world, advising governments and corporations on the whole strategy and the process behind cities. And in a sense, this focus on how comes out of that, because the smart city movement, and we're kind of in it, whether we call it future city, innovation cities, green cities, sustainable, knowledge, there's so many different terminologies for it, but there's so much money and so much focus on it. So the reason is I'm basically talking about what we call the how, because everything has a why, a what, and a how. So we know the cities are big, we know all about the 50%, etc. But we know that the cities are all at different starting points as well. So there's always going to be a process of how cities actually improve and how they actually move from one point to another. And that's why the EU, the Horizon 20 program, has billions of dollars a year. I'm living in Singapore. There's tens and tens of millions of dollars being spent on different think tanks within Singapore. I sit on a panel for the URA, the Urban Redevelopment Authority, to hand out money for smart city grants. And there's so much money flying around the world on this. Obviously here in the UK you've got the technology catapults, the city catapult, and every part of the world seems to have one of these programs. And generally we have to start with, why do we do things? And I think there's always been a lot of focus on that, and I tend to find that we see the focus on why we should be smart, or why we should have smarter cities. It gets quite a lot of press at the why level, as in we should do it, because there's so much activity. My company, Cisco, has launched something in Shoreditch. It's got all sorts of things going in Hungary. It's got stuff going on in Rio, in Florida, in Korea. Billions of dollars are being spent on this by Cisco, by IBM, because the smart city discussion has tended to have been led by the technology companies. And the reason for that is because everybody thinks that you can do more with less via technology. Now, I had some students at NUS, National University of Singapore, do some work for me a few weeks ago. They came up with 132 different definitions for a smart city. So there is no kind of, formulaic sort of thing. This is what it is. And that's why I'm kind of proposing, in a sense, that we should focus not so much on the definition, we should focus on how we move from A to B, which I'll show you a little bit later. So we have lots of groups doing it. Obviously, we're in a future cities discussion here, so this is another group that's doing it. So it's all happening. Now the why tends to have, in my opinion, been kind of proven. So the Smart 2020 program from the climate group with Gessie kind of proved that 15% greenhouse gas emissions would be achieved if we just wired up a city. Cisco spent spent $15 million US over 6 years doing pilots and innovations to try to prove that the connected city was actually a sustainable city. And there was a huge amount of emphasis. The work was done with Arup and MIT and various other people. So there's a lot of good evidence to show that, yes, it will work. Oh, and I should mention, the other thing that gets people very excited is things like the $14 trillion there that Cisco's calculated is at stake if we wire everything up via the Internet of Everything. So this is important because this is where the private sector chases the money. So there's all this money coming from the public sector, and then the private sector's trying to chase it. And I can talk on both sides, because when I was working for Abu Dhabi building Masdar City, I was on the government side. Now I'm on the private sector side. I kind of see both arguments. So what we tend to see is a lot of what. So the what is new cities. There's Masdar. It'll never be built like that, unfortunately, because of the sheer real estate realities of Abu Dhabi. That's 5.5 million square metres of buildings. It won't be done. But it did some very interesting, innovative things that have hopefully raised the discussion. That little pod car there, that cost $1 million to build. We also had to buy the company in Rotterdam that was making it because they're about to go bankrupt. So these are the realities these sorts of developments that you actually have to do. So we know the future though is going to be interesting. There's going to be all sorts of options. We're going to have augmented reality everywhere, which we already kind of have right now. And the Internet of Everything, which is the promise of the Internet of Things, by the way, because there's two different terminologies. The Internet of Things is basically the industrial version where kind of objects are connected. Internet of Everything is when we're connected. So I've already got a little chip in my head now. So it's going to happen one day. And once all that sort of starts to happen, that's where you're going to have big data and all those sorts of interesting things, if we can manage it. So the issue though is all about the how. So if you're a city leader, jobs, jobs, jobs. I've not had a discussion with a mayor in China or somewhere else who's not worried about GDP growth, jobs, migration, all those sorts of issues. They see that as fundamental. So this is when you're getting into cluster development and you're trying to make sure that people are coming in, and that's building money, building infrastructure, building quality of life, etc. But it's all starting at bringing business in first. But what's starting to happen now is the one down the bottom is one of the interesting ones where we see everything as a service. So I've done a lot of work with the city of Barcelona building a thing called the City Protocol last year. You've got people coming into the city of Barcelona saying, hey, we'll provide district heating as a service. And they're saying, well, hang on, we don't actually own all of the bits and pieces that we need to give to you to actually operate it. Because cities are complex. Because you've got to go from that to that. And that's really tough. And that's expensive. And that's why the promise of the technology to actually do more with less, is promising. But because they're so complex, everyone's got a different opinion. And everyone here comes from a different background. Everybody in cities comes from a different background. That's different opinions last year when we were building the city protocol in Barcelona on what it should be. So 45 people gave 45 completely different responses, and they were all involved in cities. And we had 150 people doing it, we got 150 different responses. And we tend to overthink what it should be, because when we start to think about smart cities and moving the needle, we want to get from A to B or from 1 to 2. Now, ISO's building standards, all sorts of people are building standards, but what are they? How do we use them? Most of the time, the city wants to improve its energy performance and reduce, let's say it wants to be more efficient with water and wants to get from 400 litres per person to 200 or 100 or whatever the figure is. They know where they are, they're at 1. The data around that is benchmarking. And then they get some consultants in, some good consultants, engineers or McKinsey's and Booz, etc. And they try to work out how do we get from 1 to 2. And they then start to quantify what's the cost, what's the return, who does what. And that's kind of the main thing that we want to focus on, is getting from 1 to 2. Rather than just trying to focus so much on trying to nail down one and actually say, this is what it is. Because it's really hard with the dynamics of cities, and I think we've had discussions about the issues with boundaries and what is a city. It's really hard. Global City Indicator Forum from the World Bank in Toronto, is trying to put that together, and there's so many different city indicators. And Greg Clark, I think, is talking tomorrow, or has done papers just on the different indicators. It's very confusing, So therefore, personally, I think the important thing is just to focus on being smarter, not worried about defining where you are. And this is Budapest. So when you look at the city, it's a lovely city. There's a river, there's a bridge. Looks nice. But what it is, it's a massive amount of silos that don't like to talk to each other. And this is not singling out Budapest. This is the realities of cities. Cities around the world are masses of silos of different industries that have never really had to talk to each other much until now, because the convergence of technology is allowing things to happen. So having everything connected sounds all very exciting, but the lawyers for each of those different silos are saying, I'm not going to give you my data. The BBVA Bank in Spain has collected all of its data for its credit card transactions and can plot it in real time on a GIS map. But they're not going to give it away, because PayPal and everyone else are taking their business away. Why should they give that out for free? So, most of the data in cities, actually about 98% of data in cities is not actually utilised for those sorts of reasons. And the complexity is basically this. Every city has a mass of different stakeholders who run the city on behalf of the users, which is us. So you've got the policymakers, the regulators, that's the government side. Then you have the developers, owners and operators of assets. And all of those guys have to try to play together. And what happens in the middle is you get the private sector and the government sector, you know, trying to play nice. PPP gets thrown out all the time. PPP is code for government has no money, private sector pay. I then have a leader in my company say to me, can we get the PPP where we don't have to pay? Tough. Someone's got to pay. But this is what's happening. And so new business models, consumption models, are kind of clashing in at the moment and try to actually, you know, come together and actually make things, allow things effectively to be unlocked, even though you've got cities that have been built over centuries in the brownfield environment, that it's really hard to separate things. A friend of mine in DC said, when I asked, who owns all of the sewers in America? And she used to work at the Green Building Council. She said, not really sure, it's really complicated. And nobody wants to own the sewers anyway, because it means you've got to replace them. You know, I think London sewers are now 180 years old or something, Bazalgette sewers. You know, one day they'll have to be replaced. So in the middle of all that, you've got this fight, as I said, between government sector and private sector, which leads to a top-down and a bottom-down kind of approach. So we know all about congestion in cities. And if we reduce congestion in cities for cars running around, that's probably about 30% of the congestion, 40% of the congestion looking for a car park. So there's two ways of doing it. One in New York, where you've got a little app on your phone, and you sell your car space, so to speak, to somebody who's coming out of a restaurant, or you're coming out of a restaurant. The other way is you go and put in a car parking sensor in the street, and the company will charge $600 per unit per annum to the municipality for that. You've got the same problem being solved, which is informing the public who's going to look for a car park. One is top down, one is bottom up. There's a role for each. I had a question last year on a panel in Barcelona where somebody asked the panel, should we install sensors all across the city, or should we just crowdsource with mobile phones and everything? The panel couldn't answer the question. They said, we don't know. So there's a lot of questions in this, but the trick is to actually work on this how part of it, because we have, in my opinion, around the world at times, we have a little bit too much focus, I think, on the why and the what. Lots of companies sell the what because what is tangible. Here is a what. I'll sell you a what. The why is always why you should have the what. But I think it's really good that we spend a little bit more time just focusing on the why. And that's why it's really good to have a process, especially in cities, as to how you think things through. And it tends to be, in my opinion, as I say, why, what, and how. But the how is all about the business model, the policy issues, etc. And private sector tends to, as I said, focus too much on the what and make things that are often uneconomic or actually illegal in different jurisdictions. And I've seen it time and time again. So the disruption is coming because the technology is allowing that. So people are getting excited, there's money in it, and people are chasing the money. And it's all that convergence, but we've got to unlock the roles and work out who will do what to enable us to understand how. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invite to be here. My name is Anna Walnycki. I work with the Human Settlements Group at the International Institute for Environment and Development, and I have been working for the last, I've mainly focused on urban poverty, and I've been working with Diana Mitlin and David Satterthwaite to try and collate some of the work that they've been doing with some of the federations of urban poor groups, international federations of urban poor groups around urban poor funds. So a lot of the things that I'm presenting here today are these, including some of the slides, but any errors are mine, okay? Okay, so what I'm going to do in this presentation is outline some of the blockages that have stopped development aid from addressing urban poverty effectively, and that have pushed the urban poor to mobilise and organise and look for alternative funding mechanisms for community-led development in informal settlements. And I'm going to draw specifically on the impact of one regional fund in Asia, which is called ACCA. It's the Asian Coalition for Community Action Programme, which is organised by ACHR, which is the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights. And I'm going to demonstrate how this fund has very practical impacts to address urban poverty, but it also creates spaces for the urban poor to engage in planning and policy making processes at the city level, which leads to more strategic gains where it has significant political implications for the urban poor. So, just a bit of an outline. You're probably all very familiar with these facts, but 1 in 7 people in the world live in informal urban settlements. This means that they live in substandard housing, they have inadequate, expensive or non-existent basic services. They have insecure land tenure, and they don't have access to finance to be able to do the things that they want to do locally. So they don't have access to mortgages, they don't have bank accounts, they don't often even have the means to access microfinance, which has been peddled as this big solution, but it's not necessarily the case. And so the aid that's been directed towards urban poverty hasn't been responsive. Local governments that are in place are weak, often under-resourced to be able to address the problems that exist locally. And so it's not really surprising that the urban poor have begun to mobilise and organise. And I've split a rather long quote up over the course of this presentation, but I'll begin with it now because these words come from Sumsuk Bunyabancha, who is the coordinator of ACHR, which is the federation that's running this local fund that I'm going to outline a bit more about in this presentation. And she says, in most development processes around the world, almost all of the resources that finance development are controlled by people who are not themselves in need. They're not slum dwellers, they're not poor, they have never experienced deprivation of any sort, yet they set the systems, make the rules and design the structures, and expect all those poor souls on the ground to follow what they say, and it never works. That finance never reaches those people on the ground in any significant way to help them make any significant change. We know that and they know that. And so just to kind of, this slide is I've stolen directly from David Satterthwaite, but it outlines some of the blockages as to why development aid doesn't reach its intended beneficiaries, who are the urban poor here. So you've got aid agency with all the aid agency which has all its policy decisions. It's sort of shaped and affected by all these other interests here: commercial interests, environmental lobbies, other NGOs, political public opinion and the media. And then it has this very complex internal structure whereby it likes to grant money to big projects through few staff. It doesn't want to give small amounts of money out to slum dweller groups in developing countries. The funds then go to recipient governments who have their own priorities, and then it goes to local government who are often too weak to be able to implement policies that are going to directly impact on the intended beneficiaries, who are the urban poor. And so the kind of the idea that IID have been playing with some of these federations of urban poor is, what if the aid agencies could just give money directly to the intended beneficiaries, the urban poor, so that they could start addressing poverty on the ground themselves? They don't want to do that for a whole host of reasons, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. So this is the fund. This is what we'd like to happen. So that's the question: how can international finance be used to fund local community-driven initiatives? And there are two significant examples of this, and I'm just going to touch upon one. There is the Urban Poor Fund International, which is managed by SDI, Slum Dwellers International, which is an international federation of slum dwellers that pans mainly Africa, Latin America and parts of Asia. And then there is the Asian Coalition for Community Action Programme, which is coordinated by ACHR. Okay, so this programme channels funding from the Gates Foundation. It was established in 2010 to support the work, to support slum upgrading work that's being done by community groups all across Asia. It exists in 19 countries, and the funding is principally used, is principally decentralised to the national level, whereby community groups can access the funding to undertake enumeration and mapping of local needs, and then to develop small-scale and large-scale programmes around slum upgrading. So that can be building houses, developing basic services, looking to secure land tenure. It all really depends on the local context, and that's sort of what really underpins the whole process. The achievements to date, so there are citywide upgrading activities going on in 165 cities across 19 Asian countries, 111 big housing projects, which often mean that they have to engage with local government in order to be able to develop these housing projects. There are 1,185 small community-driven initiatives, and these can be small-scale housing projects, or they could be small-scale basic the development of small-scale basic services, depending on the needs of the communities. National surveys in 7 countries, because often governments don't have any idea what's going on in these informal settlements, who lives there, what their needs are, and what they would like to have them in the future. But also, there's a growing... the fund has also been used to address disaster rehabilitation projects, so the impact of cyclones in other parts of Asia that have had quite devastating effects on informal settlements. What's really great about the ACCA process is the budget that was allocated by the Gates Foundation accounts for only 66% of the total project value. Because what you find happens is that local governments see that communities are doing something, and they are willing then to either give land or finance towards this project because they don't really have the means to do it themselves. And they've also seen that the community are doing it themselves. So 6% of the money comes from ACCA, $75.7 million worth of land has been leveraged, which is pretty impressive. But also, I think the really important thing to remember is that this whole process is underpinned by community savings. So the groups that apply to this fund already have saving mechanisms in place. So they've invested time and resources into themselves, and it builds a sense of ownership over the process. And like I said, the sort of projects, the small-scale projects that they do are really, really diverse. So this is around in the Philippines. This stretch of coastline is obviously becoming eroded. There's just $750 from ACCA. The local community leveraged further financial support from the local municipality to develop a small tidal defence there. So these are the sort of things that are developing, and they also demonstrate how these are not just housing upgrade things, but things that are kind of building more resilient communities in light of some of the local environmental challenges that are facing these areas. And so I think there's just a few things that I'd say is why do these international funds for local initiatives really work? Firstly, they provide flexible, affordable finance for marginalised groups. Like I said, microfinance isn't necessarily available to these groups. They want small amounts of loans, very, very small amounts of funding in order to be able to develop, in order to be able to upgrade their communities. Local savings, choices and knowledge, their participation within these processes means that there's a level of investment. It's needs driven, so these are the local community understands what they need in order to be able to upgrade their settlement, and the projects that are implemented reflect this. It builds relationships between marginalised communities and local government, and I think this is really key. The co-production of services and projects really means that these communities that have been marginalised by the state develop a relationship with the state. So there are practical and strategic benefits for the urban poor. And then I just want to focus down on one element of the ACCA project, which ACHR have really been pushing recently, which are the city development funds, because I think it really relates to what we're talking about in this session. So So, like you can see, right, you might have picked up from my presentation so far, the projects might be quite disparate. You know, you might within this in the space of the city, you might have lots of small projects going on in different settlements. The initiative to develop city development funds means that communities, informal settlements that exist across the communities, can come together, and local city governments can invest in a city development fund. This means that the urban poor are integrated into some upgrading processes, and it also, and I think as people sort of consider what this will be in the future, if you had established city development funds whereby you have lots of stakeholders from the city, it has the potential not just to attract money from donors, but potentially from the private sector if it was seen to be doing. If it seems to be having a positive effect on the city. And so, but the situation that lots of the urban poor groups are in at the moment is that donors aren't that interested in this approach. And so this is the end of the quote that I began the presentation with from Susenco, and it says, in this experiment with ACCA, we are seeing how even a very small amount of money can allow people on the ground to make a lot of breakthroughs, a lot of change. But those finance controllers are not crossing the river, and that's the agencies, from their old conventional top-down side to this new side, to see how finance can actually give people the freedom to do so many things. And that's it.
It's a great pleasure to welcome Jo, who's had a background in urban regeneration as well as in public and private sectors, as well as in urban land use. So,
Tell him the truth, Michael. I'm terrified because, of course, Michael has been my boss in various contexts. He's been on boards of governors of regeneration agencies that I've been trying to run. And the terrible truth is that we always have horrible rows where he critiques all the things that I've been trying to implement. The good thing about it is that he always buys dinner afterwards. Anna said something I thought was hugely important about the capability of local government and its ability to get money to where it's genuinely required. I guess we'll talk about this afterwards, but this is a crucial thing in the challenge of implementation, because most civil servants, and I was one for a decade in Whitehall, are petrified of being hauled in front of select committees, especially the Public Accounts Committee, where there's an expectation that you'll have full transparency and minimized risk. And it's impossible to channel money to the places that need it most and to put it into the hands of the people who often are closest to understanding the problem if you are going to try and squeeze risk out of the system. So the system has its own imperative that forces you to avoid risk. I'm not an academic, so I don't carry the burden of needing to sort of work with evidence or logic. And so what I'm going to do is go through this very, very quickly, and I'll give you the chance to argue back in a few minutes. I guess what I'm going to say is based on a practitioner's point of view. As Ben was saying, I'm implicated in some of the heinous crimes of regeneration in this country, going back as far as sort of late 80s and early 90s, through various regeneration programs, including running the National Strategy for Neighbourhood Renewal, and then trying to put the basic template in place for the creation of a legacy from the 2012 Olympics for East London. So it's informed by that, and so here's my point of view. My point of view is shaped by my current role at the Urban Land Institute, which is an organisation of city makers, private sector largely, but increasingly public sector partners too. It's a place where the public and private sector come together to think about the responsible use of land to create sustainable communities around the world. So, there are cities right now who are either thinking about bidding for a Games or readying themselves to host one. So right now, Sochi and Glasgow are thinking about their Winter Olympics and their Commonwealth Games respectively. Oslo and various others, Austin, Texas, are thinking about whether they should bid to host the next Winter Olympics and Summer Olympics after the current cycle runs through. Lots of cities make a gamble, they make a bet that an investment in hosting a big global sporting or cultural event will produce huge dividends, both in cash terms and in urban development terms. In cash terms, because the assumption is that this will lead to a massive uplift in visitor and tourism numbers, and in medium term, they assume that it will invite in a whole host of both public and private investment to fuel the future development of their city. Question, is that ambition defensible? Is it evidenced by prior experience, or what really goes on? So very quickly, I'll ask, is there an issue here? What does the London story tell us from a kind of what does the standard narrative about London and its 2012 Olympics experience tell us? What might a longer view of the urban development issues flowing from the Olympics here in London invite us to think about? And then I'll want to leave you with a couple of questions so that we can have that argument at the end. So going back, those of you who are over a certain age will remember, they'll remember the theme tune, brilliant theme tune to the Montreal Olympics. Montreal Olympics 76, famous for being boycotted by the African athletes. So the games itself was substandard because the quality of the athletic competition was weakened by the absence of some of the athletes. What was also interesting in urban development terms, though, was brilliant stadium. The games was in 1976, brilliant stadium. And the debt on the stadium was only paid off, I think, 3 years ago. Okay? The games that's the poster child for a cost-effective Olympics, Atlanta. Well, this is the stadium that now is occupied by the Atlanta Braves, owned by Ted Turner of CNN fame. And within a year of the Atlanta Olympics closing, it was converted into a baseball stadium, connected, woven into the urban fabric quite successfully, and generated high quality public space that the downtown area of Atlanta lacked. It's all done on budget, all done to time, lots of it financed by the private sector, but it was criticised as being a commercialised games. Athens got many benefits in infrastructure terms from its hosting of the games. New subway system, new tram system, fantastic upgrades to mass transit, hugely important, big infrastructure gains. Question, the Olympic Village, now substandard, semi-abandoned or occupied but not in the way originally envisaged. But if you look at the venues systematically, Athens was 2004, right? This is what it looks like now. Pretty much abandoned, and because they were late in construction, they paid all kinds of construction acceleration penalties, so the games actually ended up costing them a ton of extra money. And the truth is that the Greek sovereign debt hides behind it a whole series of municipal debts that the state, the national government then had to nationalise in order to sort out some of the debts left behind by the Athens Games. Now, Beijing, superb, put the city on the map and reintroduced China to the world in a new way. So reputationally, massive payoff. Opened up new fabric to the city. Question, was it worth the forced removal of the residents who lived in what was to become the Olympic area? And this kind of thing, this protest, where the state has one set of objectives, local residents have another, but local residents are going to have to be moved on. I suspect we're going to see more and more of this. I don't think the Rio disputes we saw this summer are going to be the end of it. There will be more. And of course, some of the facilities from Beijing are semi-used now. Others are visitor attractions, but they're not in active use and can't be functional without public subsidy. And even slick cities, supposedly clever cities, like Vancouver, run into trouble. The Vancouver Games famously ran out of snow, if you know the story. Winter Olympics ran out of snow. Brilliant stadium, and now in good use. The real challenge was how do you weave the Olympic area into the city fabric, and of course the really contentious issue was that the reuse of the Olympic Village was as mixed-use housing or mixed tenure housing famously went bankrupt and has only recently been rescued. It's coming to the market and about to do well, I understand, but really problematic. So cities often pile up debt, borrow, in order to bet on a games with well-intentioned understandings that this will produce either a straight profit or it will produce an urban development dividend some way down the line. So let's look at London ever so quickly. Here's how the basic story runs. London Games was brilliant, transformed the city, it was a delivery triumph, and started in 2005 when we won the bid, and the best thing about it was that we beat the French, who were also shortlisted, and the standard narrative runs that this was a delivery masterpiece. Several people got knighthoods on the back of their role in delivering, and I'd say much deserved actually, but the narrative runs that it was a piece of planning genius, that was all mapped out well, delivered on time, and that London was hugely benefited by the remediation of some former industrial sites that were contaminated and in fragmented ownership and economically underperforming. We were very clever, which I actually believe this, in that we created a framework within which two things happened at the same time. Firstly, private sector expertise was woven into the public delivery capability through the invention of a special purpose vehicle, and at the same time we managed to get alignment between central government, the city mayor Boris Johnson, and the local authorities at a more granular level, the 6 Olympic host boroughs. When did you ever find that kind of vertical harmony between governance layers in this country at least to deliver a massive project? Well, we saw it in this, and so we patted ourselves on the back for that. I think that's warranted. And then big party in 2012 and triumph. What really happened? Well, actually, visitor numbers plummeted in 2012. It didn't deliver the immediate benefit we assumed. Some of that's coming back. But actually, some people are asking, was 9.6 billion justified to fund a 6-week party? There's another school of thought, though, that says, actually, an Olympic Games is a 6-week party built on the back of a big infrastructure project. And the real challenge is, therefore, how you take an Olympic sporting endeavour and funnel it through the prism of the urban development challenge that many of us are part of. How do you use an event of this scale to drive strategic land use change, to drive strategic reintegration of marginalised communities into the civic whole? So if you take that point of view, you're looking at least to 2025 and beyond, rather than taking a view that the Olympics ended in 2012. And you reflect on the fact that London strategically is growing, has been for quite a while, and that our challenge really is to take some of the land that underperforms in East London, that also happens to be occupied by some of the city's very poorest communities, and knit it into both the physical landscape more intelligently, but also the economic landscape of the larger city corpus. And of course, it's not an accident that it's East London where the Games was located. The smartest thing that the previous Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, ever did was to insist that the Games was firstly delivered on a compact site rather than spread out across the city by and large, but that he selected East London, which was the area most resistant to all interventions to achieve regeneration. So East London, the East London boroughs are at the edge of the city and leading out to the North Kent, South Essex expansion zone that both governments, Labour, Tory, well, you might say Coalition 2, have all identified as London's growth corridor leading out to the Thames Gateway. The idea of governments as far back as '89 has been to strategically reintroduce dirty, former industrial, contaminated, economically underperforming sites at the edge of the city back into the core. And I'd say that governments of varying political stripes over 30 years have kept a planning consistency and a resourcing consistency by looking at this area as London's growth corridor. And at the end of the day, it's surprising, really, that even some of the more abandoned bits of Stratford and East London are only a couple of miles away from some of the most expensive real estate in the Western world. So this oughtn't to be a challenge that's beyond us. How did we do it? Well, everybody's quarrelling about HS2, the high-speed train that will connect London to the north. I'd say that high-speed 1 that connected London and particularly East London to Paris and beyond was crucial to the regeneration of East London. But also there were 5 brave initiatives that helped transform this wider context into which the Olympics was dropped. I'll not extend, but you know that in the last 25 years, London has created a new central business district at Docklands, mainly around Canary Wharf, that's equivalent to the entire central business district of Frankfurt. I say that with some pride because my colleague from Frankfurt is sitting at the back of the room there. But there's been a consistent investment in East London. What's been interesting, though, is that all the people who are working, well, 75% of the people who are working in the high-value jobs here travel west to east each day, and the local residents remain amongst the poorest in the country. So the Olympics was posited on the back of all of this to try and shift that in a much more concerted way. The Olympic pledges, I'll leave you to read all of them, but one of them, made by Cameron explicitly, was to transform East London and to try and narrow the gap socio-economically for residents of East London and residents of the capital as a whole. East London and the area around the Olympic site has had the largest concentration of transport investment of any region in the UK over the last 15 years. That's over and above the 9.6 billion Olympic delivery costs, but it's never spoken about. And the ambition was to create a new piece of London. Michael, I will speed up because I'll meet your deadline. And the ambition was to add to UK PLC's economy explicitly, and to achieve what wasn't called convergence, a narrowing of the socio-economic gap between the residents of East London and the scores for the capital as a whole. Now you won't see this, but does anybody live in East London? Try and move as close as you can to E9. E9 has the fastest house price improvements rate of any neighbourhood, certainly in London, but probably in the country. And it was very cheap, and now it's becoming increasingly expensive, in part because of the Olympic investment. But the thing about it is that it's positioned between established East London, near to Liverpool Street, and it's further away from the more concentrated areas of mixed and deprivation. So the real test of the Olympic investment is whether there's house price, house rent equalisation between this part of London and the rest of the capital. But do we want that by gentrification? Well, good question. So my closing note for people concerned with the public policy that drives thinking about do you bid for a games, and if you're going to deliver one, how do you do it? Certainly, a games needs to be part of a long-term strategy for regenerating or developing developing a city. You need public and private sector skills as part of your delivery capability. You really do need to align national policy and capability with local municipal capability. The cute thing that London did was make the games compact on one site, and it used a lot of temporary venues, so it didn't actually have to build all that much. Promote a brand and a reputation, certainly. Even the bidding process, I would say, is good for a city and helps them think through their long-term strategic delivery and regeneration plans. Leave a private investment wherever possible and learn lessons from other cities that have either done it well or done it appallingly badly. I close with these questions to which I don't have an answer yet, thankfully, because I'm no longer responsible for some parts of the delivery of this. Will Her Majesty's government get back the 9.6 billion from the land sales that are now starting to come through from the Olympic site? Question. This is a big challenge, and the whole financial architecture of the games was built on the assumption that it would pay back its construction costs. Open question. Will east-west land prices, house prices converge? Do we want them to? And that was one of the acid test issues for the games. Will the games produce socio-economic convergence for the poorer residents of East London and harmonise their quality of life, their standard of living with the rest of the capital, because historically they've lagged behind? And then very, very finally, and interestingly for those of us who follow football in particular, because I think there are parallel issues for FIFA, is it right that these allocation bodies, FIFA and the IOC, take most of the profit from these games and leave the cities holding the risk and some might say the debt? And I introduced the theme of football because everything I learnt about regeneration, I learnt from, somebody said before, Ben, I think, I learnt in Deptford, because my starting point in regeneration was redeveloping the stadium for Millwall Football Club. You have to be a Londoner to understand what that is. But I'll close by saying the motto of the club is one that I've lived by for a long time. And the motto, of course, is, no one likes us, we don't care.
Now Andrew Gouldson is going to make a response to those papers, and then we'll open up for 15 minutes or so of questions to get you away, just 15 minutes later than we had hoped. So Andrew, thank you for...
Thank you very much. I'm Andy Gouldson. I work at the University of Leeds, and for the last 2 or 3 years I've been working on the economics and financing and governance of low-carbon cities. We have done studies, mini Stern reviews and related work for several cities within the UK and also internationally. One of the projects we were involved with last year was looking at these issues in China, in eastern Chinese cities, and considering the impact of mega events of the Beijing Olympics, but also of the Shanghai Expo or the Asian Games for Guangzhou. And what became apparent very quickly there was that they did trigger enormous redevelopment at an awesome rate. And they were incredibly effective at enabling those Chinese cities to tackle some of the kind of more tractable problems associated with urbanization. But they were not so effective at enabling them to deal with some of the more wicked structural problems around transport and energy and so on. And so they enabled a level of catch-up, I think, for those cities that China's now trying to learn from as it diffuses experience out, especially to Western China. But they still left the wicked, unsolvable problems largely unsolved. So my work relates very closely to all three of the other presentations too, around green growth, I suppose, in particular, and the financing of low-carbon city development. And I suppose to offer a slightly more kind of academic spin on it, what I think all three of those presentations showed, and probably the last presentation on mega events too, is the kind of green growth agenda at work. Green growth is a major theme. I'm sure academics can have seizures thinking about it and all the contradictions involved in that term. But you know, the World Bank, for example, has an inclusive green growth agenda, which relates very closely to the issue of urban poor, developments that favour urban poor, pro-poor development, and so on. And then UNEP and OECD and all sorts of others have green growth strategies. And I suppose what I would comment on the presentation is that green growth creates an opportunity to deal with to address some of the more tractable problems. But it doesn't necessarily create much potential to deal with the wicked problems, perhaps in the same way as the mega events. In that, green growth is an alignment between a mode of governance and a mode of financialization, I suppose. Often, normally, perhaps even a neoliberal mode. It's based on a private business case and new business models which enable investors and financiers to unlock potential for green growth. And to that extent, it kind of depoliticizes, because it's relatively consensual. Who would argue against economic growth and environmental protection and social development all at the same time? But it also kind of technocratizes transitions up to a point. And therefore, these processes of green growth can mobilize elite support for urban regeneration and for climate change related initiatives. They can enable finance and investment to flow into urban development. They can engender some level of public support for a period, and they can achieve what all of our studies have shown is moderate levels of decarbonisation, but probably only moderate levels of decarbonisation. The problem with them, in a way, is that they have a series of negative spillover effects in terms of their broader impact, in that they, as we've said, don't necessarily enable cities to tackle these wicked problems, and they focus on extracting private value from urban regeneration, and they leave many of the more technically complex or economically unattractive or socially challenging issues for other people at some other stage. And they rely on elite political and economic support, but they, to some extent, often exclude and disempower social actors. They erode trust and social capital. And so the legacy they leave behind is not always a positive one. And therefore, I think we can think about alternative modes of governance and modes of financialization for urban regeneration, especially as it relates to climate change. And I think the comments made about community or crowdsourced financing are especially fascinating, something that I'm very interested in at the moment, because I think it's possible to think of green growth and sustainability strategies based not on a private business case, but on a broader social case, where we think of them repoliticizing and democratizing development rather than doing the opposite, where they're financed from the inside in ways where the finance is kind of locally connected rather than being disconnected from a sense of place and ownership by communities. They can focus on the generation of collective benefits and positive spillovers within cities rather than, again, the opposite. And perhaps the most fundamental point is that in the end, green growth strategies are limited if they just focus on efficiency gains and fine-tuning existing structures and systems, with the thinking that once we've done that, we will then move on to address those underlying structures and systems and the kind of structural limits, I suppose, of retrofit. The logic would suggest that you should get the fundamentals right and then fine-tune that, rather than fine-tuning something which is not ever going to be able to be deeply, radically decarbonised, and then think about replacing that with something radically different. So we see this in the UK, and I think some of this came out in the presentations. We see retrofit schemes which are spending and can spend billions and billions of pounds on the early stages of transition to low-carbon cities. And they probably can get to 40–50% decarbonisation within 10–15 years. So there's an optimistic story for the early stage, but at the end of that early stage transition, they'll be left with a mildly decarbonised city that has spent billions of pounds getting to that point. And you may then have to write off those billions of pounds of investment in order to get a deeply decarbonised city of the type which we're going to need by 2050. And I think there's a story there which relates to climate resilience as well as and to broader forms of sustainability. So I think that, in summing up, the financing argument around sustainable cities has done well to get some traction and get some movement. But I think as academics and commentators, we need to think much harder about the kind of financialisation, the kind of governance arrangements which will deliver deeply decarbonised and fundamentally climate resilient and more broadly sustainable cities.
Thank you.
I'm Matthew from the City of Westminster. We're going well with the legacy side of things for us. The ego and pride side of things that are associated with a bid, and you often get political representatives who, take it on their own, even if it's not in the city's best interest. How do you address and counter the pride element when you're trying to focus on the evidence of whether it is a good thing to bid or not bid?
We're currently doing some work with Oslo, and they had a massive public debate and a referendum to decide whether the city ought to bid, and they voted yes. That contrasts with other cities where effectively it's not the city that's bidding, it's the national government, and there's a national pride argument. Standing in between those two is the experience of Rome in this bid cycle for the Olympics. It was fascinating that Tokyo, Istanbul and Madrid were the shortlisted cities, considered before Tokyo was given the nod. What was fascinating was how you got to the shortlist of three, because people were talking about the Rome bid until Mario Monti and others banned the city from submitting the bid. So there's a tendency for people at the municipal level to want to play on this local pride issue, and at some point somebody has to decide whether it's an affordable bid and whether it's viable. And if you're Oslo, you have a referendum, and if you're Rome, you pursue the thing until, a grown-up says to you, this is preposterous. There is a view that Sochi is a completely unsustainable bid because the population in the city and the location of the city means that there aren't enough local people to use the facilities that are going to be built, and it's too remote to attract the number of visitors that would keep those facilities in place subsequently. So maybe that bid is all about national pride, but we shall see, because stranger things have happened.
Okay, other comments? Someone here?
Yeah, thank you, John Lauerman. My question is also for Joe. And I'm wondering if you could perhaps answer the last question you have on the slide, or speculate on this last question, because what is a very common experience in many Olympic host cities is that there's sort of a separation of risk and profit. Certain stakeholders take on the risk, often municipal governments or national governments. And the profit streams don't necessarily tie back to those stakeholders directly. And as you point out, the IOC and FIFA play a major role in sort of separating the two. So I'm wondering if you could speak more about strategies to sort of change the way that works, to disrupt that separation, or to empower cities in this process.
Okay, just before you answer that, Joe, maybe I could spread that around the panel a little bit as well, because I guess one of the things that is common to all of the presentations was how we think about the risk and return calculus, because if £9 billion doesn't means a lot to the British government, it means very little to Beijing, but I guess for the Gates Foundation, you were saying you have 70 million as opposed to 9 billion. So I suppose in each of the presentations there was something about how we might think differently about both financial risk, but also the socialisation of return. But and also I should have given everyone, out of good manners, a chance to come back on the comments as well. So on both of those, Joe, if you wanted to kick off, and then I'll give everyone else a chance as well.
Let me link it to what colleagues were saying. I understood what several of my colleagues here were saying as being about the way I interpreted it was one of the roles of policymakers is to find the right mix of incentive and regulation to create the circumstances within which a market can respond to local challenges. So a lot of the green energy opportunities arise because a policymaker has created the right mix of regulation and incentive that allows the marketplace to step in and take a risk. I think when it comes to Olympics, the market is speaking in a certain sort of way, in that I think the question that faces both FIFA and the IOC is that we're getting to a point where only rich cities supported by rich governments can even begin to think about hosting a games. And what's really going on in terms of the financing of cities and their development is Detroit. Is the fact that San Bernardino is half a step behind Detroit on the way to bankruptcy. That Moody's systematically downgraded all Italian cities and all Spanish cities because of their inability to confidently repay their bond requirements on time. So I think as cities become more and more financially stretched, there's going to have to be fairer shares. But, you know, risk return, I think it's about how policymakers can create a space for a market, either for green progress or for urban development.
Anna, did you want to?
I'm not sure if your comment's going to link more directly to that, because or not.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, just to stretch it out from just beyond the session we've just had to the day, I was really struck with Arwen's presentation this morning about what's going on in Berlin, and I think the dichotomy that we've had between public and private in the past, possibly a slightly informed by a sort of a Thatcherite view of the world, might change, and that the idea that public becomes civil, whether it's energy or energy infrastructure or water infrastructure or possibly even a games, you know, is a really powerful concept.
Did you come on in after that?
Well, I mean, it's slightly different, but it's sort of going on from that, I suppose, is that I think what my presentation was trying to show is that with a very small amount of money, local communities are not just, it's not necessarily just about community-led provision, but it's about communities plugging into local governments that aren't necessarily capable or haven't been able to provide the basic services that the urban poor need. So it's not necessarily, it's this kind of emerging middle ground where communities are co-producing services and things with the state, but again the risk is much greater with the urban poor. You know, no one wants to really take a chance on it.
Go on, or Mazda.
Well, I was actually thinking mega projects and the who pays and back to the financing and really why people are motivated to do it. I mean, Mazda was done because the response from the Abu Dhabi government always is, why are you doing this? And the response was, because we can and because we should. Now, that's a very nice little sort of line, but they could do it, and it was a matter of obviously pride. But you look at other events, you look at the Shanghai Expo in 2010, massive development, kind of like an Olympics, major regeneration, pavilions built everywhere that were beautiful. Most of them were then absolutely ripped down. What it does is it basically keeps economic growth ticking over at 9%, or whatever the figure is that they need to keep achieving as the migration is coming through.
It creates a tabula rasa.
Yeah. So there's multiple reasons why everyone does this. So.
Okay, the last round. If anyone's got, I've got somebody here. Anyone else want to come in before I give? We're beginning to knock on the doors of the pub opening time. But, okay, we'll give you. So is there someone over? Okay, I've got 1, 2, 3. We'll take them in that order. So, sorry, yes.
My question's for Anna. I'd just like to hear a bit more about the process through which local communities are able to tap the funds that you talked about in the first place. And I mean, the example that you included on the slide was from the Philippines. So I was also wondering whether countries that have certain forms of democratic decentralization might lend themselves more to these kinds of processes that you talked about.
Okay, we'll take them all. If that's it. There was someone just over here. Was there? I think Igor was it yourself, and there was somebody else over there. I think as well. But we'll take them.
Just quickly, I really like the Mark's presentation. Congratulations. And I think that the last point about the public and the private divide and how the cooperatives maybe could be a really good model. I think I agree with this, and maybe that connects with the comment of Michael about the commons. I think at the local level we need to really create something that is a new equation, economic equation with the commons. But I have just a question to Gordon. It's just a quick, brief question. Where is represented the civil society in Cisco's smart city model?
Okay, and I'm sorry, I lost somebody somewhere in that region. Maybe they've gone silent. Apologies from my side. Okay, we'll take those few, and maybe we start from this end this time, and then go through.
Right. So, sorry, Igor. The question was, what is Cisco's
where
civil society?
Civil society in the smart model.
Yeah, it's one that's really just closely joined in really with the public sector. So Cisco works very closely with governments around the world on pilots. So, for example, in Barcelona, Amsterdam, Nice, there's many pilots being worked through. So we don't actually go out and lead and say this is, how it will be. We actually go out and listen and talk and have the dialogue to actually get the feedback before we then come out and do that, because any private sector company like Cisco is not going to try and come out too much and make things without making sure that the client, who's going to be actually the buying centre, is actually going to buy it. So it is very important to make sure that we are working with the governments. Now, the city governments must be the ones who are obviously taking the lesson from the people that they represent. So honestly, that's the best way that we work with them.
Okay, Mark?
Yeah, I think just to modify the comments about the role of civic a little bit, I think the comment was also made that civic structures have taken a bit of a battering this week, not least, for example, with Co-op being taken over by a hedge fund. And I think one of the reasons that we're particularly interested in community ownership of renewables is that large-scale structures like wind turbines or solar farms can actually change a community's sense of place, and that's one of the reasons why they can be very opposed to those projects. But if you invite them in and buy them in, actually it gives them a very positive sense of place and how the development is interacting with that place. And I think that there's an important role for civil structures, but they could outgrow that feeling about sense of place, or, to take a games or a big event, sense of mission. So if you outgrow that sense of mission, or with a co-op, I think that probably did outgrow its mission, its original mission. And I think that there's a very important role in the governance agenda, if you like. There's a very important set of principles to develop about how community can invest in projects and get it right and avoid getting it wrong.
Well, so the model's very different in every context, and I think that's a reflection of the fact that one of the messages that you often hear from the groups is that development initiatives or aid projects or things that are focused on addressing urban poverty are somewhat of a square peg in a round hole. They're just trying to roll something out that's going to meant to fit in their community. It doesn't necessarily. So the funding is often adapted around pre-existing national structures that have emerged around community savings groups within different countries. So in Sri Lanka, there's actually a women's-led community savings structure that the money's kind of plugged into, and people will borrow the money through those existing structures. Whereas in Vietnam, the structures the funding is much more closely aligned to the state because of the way the state is decentralised and the way the community groups play a role in local development. So the way that the funding is used and structured is deliberately structured around these structures that exist already. So it's very different in every instance. But the ACHR website, ACHR are absolutely amazing in documenting all the stuff and the progress that's been made, so it's just worth having a look at their website.
Joe, is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, at the risk of being too South London, anybody who wants a bit of entertainment, I'd recommend a really good and studious read. It's called Crap Towns 100. And quite high on the list of supposedly crap towns is Hull, Kingston on Hull. And
the top, I believe.
Sorry?
It's the top.
Yeah.
Number one.
Oh yeah. Crap town of the year, Hull. And one of the mistakes Hull made was to demutualize an institution that had been created, that stood between the council and the market, that had developed and owned profitably for years a local telephone system, local telephone network that provided low-cost telephony to the people of Hull. What did they do? They sold it. What are they paying now? Market prices.
Okay. On which note, could I first of all actually thank the team who've been supporting us today. They will be named and supported, thanked more resoundingly again tomorrow. But also thank yourselves as the audience for soldiering through today and hopefully having a fantastic set of sessions. But finally, could we also thank the speakers for their contribution in this final session.